One of our biggest existential fears as humans is being forgotten. Our importance and value overlooked, our impact sparking no change, our existence never again thought of, the contents of our life being nothing more than a blip in the timeline of the universe. If I can no longer tell my story, who will? And for the longest time, it seemed like this was the fate for the story of Sixto Rodriguez. His legend was shrouded in mystery as it sank to the back of the minds of the few who he had drifted past, until it was unearthed decades later as one of the most interesting, unbelievable, and bittersweet music stories of all time. His career was able to get the full circle ending it deserved, but the story wasn't over. With 2 studio albums, around 25 songs in total released to the public, an hour and a half worth of hauntingly beautiful music, and the most timeless lyrics and storytelling, Rodriguez is as important today as he ever was. From singing blues in Detroit factories to starting a revolution in South Africa, let's talk about one of the craziest stories in music history. Sixto Rodriguez was the 6th son of Mexican immigrant parents, hence the name Sixto, born in Detroit, Michigan in the summer of 1942. And honestly, from here, most of the information known about him was only what was told through his music, and what we know the city and country was like at the time.
Born in the troubled city, in rock and roll USA, in the shadow of the tallest building.
Detroit was already the hotspot for the new and booming auto manufacturing industry, referred to as the Motor City. But after World War II, the demand for factory workers became even higher as it was filled with an influx of immigrants from all around. The newfound communities of different minorities and race relations in 1940s America in turn made the city very divided, where families like Rodriguez's, that's going to be really hard to say this whole video, Rodriguez's, unfairly suffered as they worked to pay off a systemic debt. As he followed in his family's footsteps and worked different hard labor jobs, he started to notice the problem with the world around him and question the powers that caused him and so many people like him to be mistreated. Around the age of 16, he started to learn how to play the family guitar, and somewhere along the line he discovered a passion for music and used it as his outlet to discuss these issues. And we are all luckier for it.
Garbage ain't collected, women ain't protected, politicians using, people they're abusing, the mafia's getting bigger, like pollution in the...
Considering it's the genre of music he made, Rodriguez would have most likely grown up listening to rock and blues, the most popular music in his area at the time, blues clearly having the most influence on him. And this genre of music has such a long, deep-rooted history that I would need a whole other video just to go over its importance. But in the simplest terms, it represents and details the hardships so many people face and was used as a soundtrack to get them through it, while also highlighting the important values that gave this life of constant struggle any meaning, like love, family, happiness, and hope. So it only makes sense that Rodriguez would use this style of storytelling to unravel the problems of the city he grew up in and what it became by the 1960s. Again, there is a very loose history on this guy, but we know that in 1963, at the age of 21, he had his first of 3 daughters, and from their accounts, he was as real and as pure as his music would lead you to believe. But as he's trying to support them, working different jobs, he starts to write and record music, performing it in different bars around Detroit. His lore started to build as he would show up to jobs dressed in fancy suits, having this magical quality about him, and at night he would drift through the city and sing heartfelt ballads in one of the roughest parts of the country. In 1968, his local fame had brought his sound to the attention of Dennis Coffey, who saw him play at a bar called The Sewer, and Dennis had worked with the likes of Stevie Wonder, Ringo Starr of the Beatles, and Marvin Gaye as a music producer through Motown Records. And if you haven't looked into the history of Motown or just aren't aware of the music that came from it, I highly suggest you check it out. But in Detroit in 1959, the landscape of music forever changed as this label was created that brought R&B, jazz, blues, and soul to the mainstream. Needless to say, there was a real booming music industry in this city, and Rodriguez came at the perfect time, right? After being amazed by his music, Dennis Coffey brought Rodriguez to former head of Motown Clarence Avant, the creator of a new label called Sussex Records, who had legendary singer Bill Withers on the roster, I might add. And they started to work on the first Rodriguez album, Cold Fact. Okay, so this is the part of the video where I'm just going to stop narrating for a minute and just geek out about these albums real quick. And there's not much new information. Rodriguez thought it was ready, everyone around him loved the album, and producers even said he was a better writer at the time than Bob Dylan. Cold Fact is the perfect name for this album because top to bottom, that's what it is, a bunch of cold facts, harsh truths. Songs like Rich Folks Hoax and This Is Not a Song, It's an Outburst give his raw perspective on the problems with the city and America and calls out the lies that the whole world is told. And all of the lyrics still apply today, and if folk rock was more popular, these would be the songs people would listen to at the modern protests.
The priest is preaching from a shallow grave. He counts his money, then he paints you safe.
Only Good for Conversation, which is an out-of-nowhere rock anthem that sounds like something Jimi Hendrix would perform at Woodstock, addresses these same issues but is sonically used to express the pent-up rage from all of it. Because generally this dude is pretty peaceful.
My statue's got a concrete heart, but you're the coolest bitch I know.
The first song on the album, which happens to be his most popular ever, Sugar Man, details the relationship between him and his drug dealer and how the dealer is a false friend. Rodriguez needs an escape from reality and his pain, but the drugs he's getting from this guy are killing him. I mean, these are Jay-Z or Nas level lyrics, man.
Sugar Man, you're the answer that makes my questions disappear. Sugar Man.
And if this guy's lyrics weren't already as real as I've ever heard, now we get into the blues. We had a mix of folk and psychedelic rock, but now here's that sad shit. Crucify Your Mind, like Janice and Jane S. Pity, hold up a mirror to the people in society going along with all the problems. The ones focused on what they want you to focus on, you know, the fakeness of it all. But then he also relates to people like him, struggling financially and mentally due to these same problems. These songs are saying, I know you feel alone in this, I do too. I don't agree with what you're doing, but I don't agree with everything I'm doing either. No one knows what to do. And personally, I find a lot of solace in these songs, and I think you guys would too, but the strings and melodies are sad enough to break down anyone.
Drifting, drowning in a purple sea of doubt. You wanna hear she loves you, but the words don't fit the mouth. You're a loser, a rebel, a cause without.
And as we can see in these songs, there's clearly a love, possible multiple love interest in his life, but his heartbreak from them brings descriptions I've never heard before and what it's like to feel this love and pain, but they are just so accurate. The last song I want to quickly talk about is I Wonder, one of the catchiest of his songs, but easily the most upbeat. This is literally the 1970s rock version of this.
I gotta know you fucked in this room. I wonder how many times you had sex, and I wonder, do you know who'll be next? I gotta know you fucked in this room.
But now that you have a sense of what this album sounded like and what his music was truly about, I want you to ask yourself if you think this would sell in America in 1970. It sounds as good as his peers, it's similar sounds, but it's a very unique style at the same time, and he had the backing of a record label? Yeah, this album not only didn't resonate and didn't sell at all, Clarence Avant, his manager, jokingly said that he thinks it sold 6 records total. Still under contract and with everyone on his label shocked that his amazing music wasn't selling at all, he had to release another album and it's almost as good as the first one. For obvious reasons, you can tell the first album had a lot more money put into it and was also attempting to be on the radio, but that just means the second one is even more raw. This album is structured very similar to his first, but the music isn't repetitive. Some of it's actually even more experimental than Cold Fact. But it just feels more like an extension of the first album. Heike's Suburbia Bus Tour and Sandraven Lullaby are your protest anthems. I Think of You and It Started Out So Nice are your love and heartbreak ballads. To Whom It May Concern and A Most Disgusting Song is him relating to the people again. And then we get Cause.
'Cause the sweetest kiss I ever got is the one I've never tasted.
Cause is one of, if not his saddest songs he's ever made, yet the instrumental feels so hopeful and triumphant. And this sound and vibe would carry on to the 3 songs that came later that were from his third unreleased album, but in a way, Cause feels like the perfect end to his album and his catalog because it's sad and harsh because it's coming from reality, that's what he does, but it sounds triumphant because it is. He accomplished his goal by making music that he liked and cared about. The second album, Coming From Reality, got the same exact treatment as the first, and then soon after, Sussex dropped him and the label itself was over within a few years. Rodriguez went back to his previous life and stopped making music, seemingly unaffected by the loss of his possible music stardom. But he clearly gained a new perspective now being a father and being able to create such beautiful art because he turned his lyrics of anti-hate, pro-change messages to getting involved in the community and running for mayor and city council of Detroit. He never got the job, but he went to school and he studied philosophy, got a degree, he showed his kids as much as he could and instilled his same beliefs, and he just kept working and living life. He's as simple as it gets. Now this is a story of Rodriguez as he told it, nothing more than an extremely talented man focused only on living life and being with family. And enjoying the vices around him, cause who doesn't, come on. But everything changed in September of 1997, 26 years since the last time he really made music, when his daughter got a phone call. Searching for Sugar Man is a 2012 Oscar winning documentary on the story of a music journalist and a record store owner from South Africa searching for Rodriguez and his real identity. This is how me and my friend found his music, and I've been listening to it ever since, but it is still to this day one of the best documentaries that I've ever seen. This is where I got almost all my facts from, and it's the main reason I made this video. It's not only an amazing story, but I get to talk about music too. Perfect. But this is where we get one of the craziest stories in music history. No one's exactly sure how the first copy of Cold Fat came over to South Africa, but the widely believed story is that an American girl brought a copy over while visiting her boyfriend, and when she hung out with all of his friends, she showed them I Wonder, and they all loved it, so they listened to the entire album all night. Whether or not this is true, all we know is that in the mid-1970s, there was a copy of Cold Fact by Rodriguez in South Africa. From 1948 to 1994, South Africa was in an apartheid, and to be honest, this is my first time hearing that term and any of this information, but basically it was compared to Nazi Germany. Not only did the government have complete control of its citizens, the media, the money, everything, segregation laws were still heavily in effect, and black South Africans were ostracized from their country. There was already a movement being sparked by the iconic Nelson Mandela that was starting to make its way around the whole continent, but for many South Africans, there was no sense of independence or self during this 50-year monstrosity. You had to think and believe whatever propaganda they told you to believe. Then that girl brought over Cold Fact. So after she showed some people, they wanted to go buy the album too, but couldn't find it anywhere in the country. This is where the underground movement began, and people started making copies of Cold Fact and sending it around town. The legend of Rodriguez and his art spread like wildfire very quickly, and finally by the mid to late 1970s, copies of Cold Fact were put into record stores. This happened to also be at the height of the South African apartheid as Mandela's movement started to break out. Tensions had never been higher, and if you spoke out or acted against the regime, you could get multiple years in prison. This very obviously transferred itself into the suburban households that became very conservative, traditional, and completely closed off to any idea of rebellion. You don't talk or listen to music about drugs, breaking the law, and definitely never about sex. As I said earlier, I Wonder is easily his most catchy and upbeat song, but those first lyrics of I wonder how many times you've had sex hit South African suburbans like a storm. The lyrics were so different and rebellious from what they were used to that it very obviously became this taboo album that everyone would talk about but wouldn't dare be caught listening to. But as the message of Rodriguez started to spread, people started to realize it was okay to question their government and who's in control. I mean, imagine thinking you could never speak out about what your country is doing to you, and then you hear this?
This system's gonna fall soon to an angry young tune, and that's a concrete cold fact.
The system's gonna fall soon to an angry young tune. I mean, this was just the music the people needed to hear. And as he became more popular and eventually a household name in South Africa by the 1980s, there was still little to no information on who Rodriguez really was. I mean, they had the album cover with some writing credits, but that only led to more questions. As more and more record store shelves became filled with Cold Fact, they would always have it placed next to the superstars that they did know. The Beatles, Simon and Garfunkel, Elvis Presley. To them, all these people were in the same vein, and Rodriguez was their favorite of this group. In their mind, he's probably as big in America, if not bigger. And this is where his legend really starts to grow. Again, this is all hearsay, but somewhere along the lines, two different rumors were started on what happened to Rodriguez. One was he set himself on fire on stage, which would be the most insane music death of all time if true. And two, it was said that in the late 70s, after his music career started to fade, he performed a show where everything went wrong. The sound was bad, the lighting, the performance itself, and this caused people to boo him off, but as he performed his last song, he went up to the front, grabbed a gun, and unalived himself on stage. Everything was set in place. You had this insane story of a mystery music man, you had the great music itself, you had people tired of the government's control but didn't know how to speak out, and now they had lyrics to help them express their ideas. Rodriguez quite literally started a revolution for the new generation of South Africans. During the 80s and 90s, the new biggest wave of South African music was created. It was really just alternative rock, but the musicians were referred to as Afrikaans, and they took rebellion to a whole new level with a more punk rock approach. And all the famous bands from this era had one big influence, the reason they started making this type of music. Yep, Rodriguez. They took his message and created a whole new sound for the time, which in turn magnified the anti-establishment cause. Thanks to people like Mandela and the rebellion the new generation started that used Cold Fact and the messages for its backbone, the apartheid ended in 1994 and South Africans were free from the government's control. Well, you know, to an extent. Around the late 80s, Cold Fact was actually banned, which made it even more desirable, but this is where we get the part of the documentary that I think is better if you just watch instead of me explaining it. The money, where did it all go? So at least 3 different South African labels, one we know is ran by this guy, somehow acquired the rights to Cold Fact and Eventually Coming From Reality and were able to distribute actual album copies from here on out. The underground copies from the 70s and 80s would have doubled Rodriguez's album sales in general, but after they were able to really sell them, Rodriguez sold over 500,000 copies in South Africa, outselling all of his peers back in America. Elvis who? The Rolling what? No, Sixto Rodriguez was bigger than all of them out here. Now this is where we get the dopest manhunt, wild goose chase, investigation, whatever you want to call it, in the history of music. The main guy in the documentary, Steven, the record store owner, was hanging out with a friend from LA back in the early 90s when the topic of Rodriguez came up. She wanted to buy some of her copies out in South Africa and bring them back to America because it was physically impossible to buy either of them. This obviously sparked Steven's interest and he started asking around. Again, I don't want to spoil this part of the documentary because I think you should just go watch it, but basically they used his lyrics, the song titles, and the song credits to find Rodriguez. And as we know from the story told directly from the source, not only was he alive and well, but he was still working in Detroit. After finding him and telling him about his importance and fame all the way on a different continent, which very obviously came as a surprise, he agreed to come out there and perform a show. When he arrived, he was treated like royalty, given the best room at the best hotel, anything he wanted, but that's not the Sixto way. He spent his time outside, and when it came time to sleep, he chose the couch or the floor instead of the luxury bedroom. He's just a simple guy, man. He ended up performing sold-out show after sold-out show where the entire country would sell an arm and a leg just to see him. They literally didn't even care if he sang songs, they would just pay to see the legend himself up on that stage. Every time I watched that first show he did, the smile on his face, the hysterical crowd, it just brings me to tears every single time. Like, I know what happens, but once I hear those first words to I Wonder, I lose it. His music career got the full circle ending it deserved. He was able to see the influence and impact he had on a generation of people. He finally got the recognition and praise that he never got back home, and he actually got paid for a lot of his music sales. But this is Sixto Diaz Rodriguez we are talking about. He gave all the money away to his daughters, family, and friends, and went right back to the house in Detroit he bought for $50 30 years ago. He never wanted fame. He never cared about money. He accomplished his music dream when he created 2 albums that he truly cared about, that he put everything he had into, a therapeutical outlet for him to release his anger and sadness and be able to learn from it. His kids were able to learn from it. Rodriguez at his core is as real as it gets. He tells it how it is and he doesn't take shit from anyone. And his 2 masterpieces are the embodiment of the harsh truths and the beauty of the world. He is the street poet, the voice of the people. So why did it take a whole documentary and decades of investigating to be aware of such a groundbreaking, important artist? Why didn't his music translate to American audiences? Well, the simplest answer, the harsh, disgusting truth, was his name. As terrible as it was, we all know that the Spanish name Rodriguez was not the first, second, or third thing any white American in 1960 was looking for when they're buying music and stuff. At the time, there was a big African American music audience with the rise of Motown, there was already the British invasion, and white Americans already had their Vietnam protest music with CCR and Bob Dylan. But there wasn't a large enough Spanish American music scene for Rodriguez to tap into. The Spanish American music at the time had heavy influence from the countries they are from and sounded nothing like the blues folk rock that Rodriguez made. So his only audience to cater to was already full on music from artists that they were groundbreaking and legendary, but so was he, man. And then we get the lyrical content and the tone of his music. Let's say he does change his name to the Sixth Prince, which was one of his aliases. I still don't think it would translate. He's talking about the same issues from a very similar anti-establishment viewpoint, but it's not the flower power hippie sounds that people were accustomed to. I mean, he's releasing these haunting ballads 2 years after the Summer of Love and Woodstock. The popular albums at the time, like What's Going On by Marvin Gaye, had such a softer, more hopeful tone. And yes, he does have hope and he was clearly motivated to make a difference, but his music was harsh. It was quite literally too cold of facts that I don't think people were ready for. Besides the personal connection you can have with his extremely introspective music, I think there are 2 big things to take away from his story. Right now, at a time where tensions are high in the world, for America specifically, we are extremely divided. It feels like a revolution is already in the works. I mean, we are due for one. I think they say we go through a cultural reset every 80 years or something, but the voices for this generation that represent similar values to that flower power movement in the 60s and 70s are very few and far between. Of course there is art out there that challenges the powers that be. I see a lot of it in movies today, but for music it seems like we don't have a soundtrack to the anti-hate, anti-establishment movement. The only ones that come to mind are Kendrick Lamar and J. Cole, but if Rodriguez didn't get his opportunity then, why not now when we seem the most lost? We need artists like him to help us express our disdain for the repetitive problems in our country. If his music actually started a movement before, it could do it again or something like it. But there's more to creating change than making a few songs. And just like Rodriguez did, we need to go out and actually make an impact. I'm not one to say how to do it, I'm learning every day, but just keeping the mindset of loving everyone around you and helping out people the way you might need help is key to us coming together. Now, the second biggest takeaway from his story has to be the fact that he never even knew people listen to his music. This one very obviously cuts deeper for me because I'm always worried about no one will care or like the things I make, but that's a flawed mindset. That's not what it's about. He made his music because he wanted to, and it meant a lot to him. And as you see from his interviews in the documentary, he never cared about it making money, but he thought it could maybe be a way to inspire others. I mean, once he found out it did, he gave the money away and just went back to living his normal life. The idea that so many people will like what you create that you're able to live off of it and do it however you want, whenever you want, is a dream I think all creators have at one point. Trust me, I get it. But this causes many artists to get discouraged, sometimes even give up when this doesn't become a reality. What is real will prosper. That's one of my favorite quotes of all time, but if you're making real, true to yourself, passionate creations, someone along the lines will appreciate it and be impacted by it. Maybe it's even just you who's impacted by it. You have to put yourself out there and make your art visible, but take his story for a perfect example. The right people just have to see it. This goes with everything in life. This doesn't apply to everyone, but sometimes we get so caught up on the idea that our life has to be remembered and have this profound impact or meaning that we will judge its worthiness on the validation of others. If I can't tell my story anymore, who will? But what is real will prosper. Impact whoever you can meet along the way. It doesn't have to be millions of people. Your story will live on with the ones you inspired, helped, and in the case of my fellow creators out there, the ones that supported and resonated with your art and message. Go create things and create them from a place of honesty. Stay true to yourself and make what you want to make. You never know who will come across your work, and you never know what it might do.
Street boy, you've been out too long. Street boy, ain't you got enough sense to go home? Street boy, you're gonna end up alone. You need some love and understanding, not that dead in life you're planning. Street boy.